We're going to begin this evening with the lighting of a Yom Hashoah memorial calendar and some remarks by Professor and by SPN, directs the Touro College Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust. She's a member of the Ontario Bar. Her areas of expertise include international human rights law, equality rights, and constitutional human rights law. She holds degrees from the University of Toronto and from Oxford. She has served as the director of the York Centre for Refugee Studies, project director for the University's Human Rights Treaty Study, member of Canadian delegations to the UN Human Rights Commission, the UN General Assembly, and the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights, and the American Society of International Law, and also a delegate to the Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women. She was formerly a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and she sits on the board of advisors of the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, a think tank focusing on issues of the United States and Israeli national security. Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
I'll just say I am the director of the Touro Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust, and we do have programming from time to time. We're also a UN accredited NGO, which means we speak at various UN events in criticism of the United Nations. I don't think I can say anything good about it at this point in time, so I add that quickly, especially on a day like Yom Hashoah, where I think that the global purveyor of anti-Semitism today is in fact the United Nations, just miles away from where we stand. If you would ever like any further information about it, don't hesitate to reach out to me personally or after this. I'm here to simply present a prayer that's composed by the Chief Rabbi for Yom Hashoah and to light this candle. Today on Yom Hashoah, we remember the victims of the greatest crime of human being against human being. The young, the old, the innocent, the 1.5 million starved, shot, given lethal injections, gassed, burned, and turned to ash, because they were deemed guilty of the crime of being different. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and turns it to stone, what happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening, what happens when humanity fails to recognize that those who are not in our image are nonetheless in God's image. We remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened, and to the victims so that robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed also of their deaths. We remember and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope. Today on Yom Hashoah, we call on you, Almighty God, to help us hear your voice that says in every generation, do not murder, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Do not oppress the stranger. We know that whilst we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future. We know that whilst we cannot bring the dead back to life, we can ensure their memories live on and their deaths were not in vain. And so, on this Yom Hashoah, we commit ourselves to one simple act, Yitzchor, remember. May the souls of the victims be bound in the bond of everlasting life. Amen. We light this yellow candle to rekindle God's flame, to shine his light upon the world once again, to sanctify the memories of the millions of souls, to honor their prayers and all their lost goals. We bless their existence by being alive. To light this yellow candle as proof we've survived.
Thank you. Friends, last year when we gathered for Yom Hashoah, we heard from a graduate of New York Medical College, School of Medicine, Robert J. Lifton, class of 1948. As you remember, Dr. Lifton is the author of more than 15 books, and last year he talked about his book, The Nazi Doctors, in which he described his study of over 30 German physicians who worked in concentration camps and on unethical medical experimentation, and how after the war they tried to rationalize their conduct and how he tried to understand their conduct. Our speaker this year is Warren Zeidman. He graduated in medicine from Northwestern University, followed by a residency in neurology at Northwestern and a fellowship in clinical neurophysiology at Rush University Medical Center. He's board certified in neurology and clinical neurophysiology. He's an associate professor in neurology, director of the EMG lab, and director of clinical neurophysiology fellowship at the University of Illinois Chicago. He also heads the multidisciplinary University of Illinois Chicago Neuropathies and Nerve Injuries Clinic. His research includes studies of carpal tunnel syndrome and ulnar neuropathy of the elbow. He's been doing research on neuropathy and epidemiology and diagnostic techniques in small fiber neuropathy. And this evening he's going to join us to discuss some of his work concerning the history and ethics of neurology, the conduct of German neuroscientists under the Nazi government, and how some diseases were named in honor of these individuals, and whether they ought to be unnamed. In both the remarks of Dr. Lifton and, as I suspect, what we will hear from Dr. Zeidman, we're going to be prompted to think about personal responsibility for one's actions, how to balance the ethical commitments of medicine and the demands of the state, and how ambition often clouds one's ethical judgment. We are reminded of the problem as described by Hannah Arendt of the banality of evil. While evil is often envisioned by sociopaths, it can succeed when average people, including average doctors, treat it as normative. Dr. Zeidman, thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. Halperin. I was very surprised and sobered and honored to be here for such an important event, and I was very impressed that this medical school has a Holocaust Remembrance Day. I think most medical schools don't. My medical school certainly doesn't. It's also a very large medical school, but without the Jewish background. But I think it's important for all doctors to realize the history of what doctors can do in a depraved state when the ethics are thrown out the window and they're able to run amok, so to speak, and commit atrocities without thinking about any consequences. Neuroscientists have an indirect connection to the Holocaust. I'll start with that because I think you'll have to bear with me. A lot of my research has dealt with collaborators, resistors, and victims of the Holocaust from a neuroscience standpoint, but it's only recently since I've been teaching a class on this to our undergraduate campus on neuroscience and international socialism, ethical and historical principles, that I've realized that it's all connected from the standpoint of victims, collaborators, and resistors even. And I'm actually writing a book about this, neuroscience, brain science, and international socialism. Hopefully be out next year by Oxford Press. And it's based on my seminar, but I'll try to distill some of the salient points from my seminar as well as my book into this talk, and hopefully I won't bore anyone, and anyone can tell me to move on if they're not interested. But I think what we were talking about before with the prevention of this in the future, I think that's kind of the key take-home point here, is how do we prevent history from repeating itself. I think we can't change the past, but I think if we can all get to the basis for what caused the Holocaust, and obviously it's very complex and you can't pinpoint any one cause, but I think if you'll bear with me, I think I'll try to demonstrate how neuroscientists were almost to a great extent responsible for aspects of the Holocaust. And I will touch on some of the eponyms that you mentioned, Dr. Halperin, as part of this larger context, and what to do with those eponyms, especially the ones based on collaborator neuroscientists. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm not a historian. I'm obviously a neurologist, as Dr. Halperin mentioned. So I've learned to do historical research, working with some colleagues in Europe as well as in the U.S. And I have a historical background from my undergraduate days. I think once I became immersed in this topic, it almost writes itself in terms of the documents that you can uncover from European archives that are untouched, essentially. There's so much work that needs to be done, and I welcome the opportunities for collaboration, by the way, with anybody who's interested in this topic. Anyway, I want to first make a tribute to Mark Schenker, who most people probably don't know. He has a connection to this medical college. is one of the co-describers of Gerstmann-Strauss-Schenker disease. It's a familial prion disorder. Most people know of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is the sporadic or the variant form of it. But there's a familial form, which is much more rare, which is described by 3 Austrian neurologists, all of whom were Jewish, one of which was Mark Schenker. Mark Schenker was Russian and then immigrated to Austria for his medical training and was there at the time of the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria by the Nazis, in 1938, and then immigrated to France and then to the U.S. So he was uprooted twice. And eventually settled in Cincinnati for about a decade, but was stifled there by provincialism as well as xenophobia in the Midwest at the time, and eventually came back here to New York and was on the faculty here at New York Medical College. And I didn't find that out until I looked at some annals of the New York Academy of Medicine. I don't think there was anything here at the university. He was mainly in private practice, but had an affiliation here. I wrote an article on him last year, but if anybody wants a copy, I will distribute that. So I want to talk about a little bit of the indirect connections with neuroscience and the Holocaust, and then I want to talk about eugenics, because most people don't have a lot of background in that, and then I want to talk about how the Nazis implemented eugenics on the neurologic and psychiatric population in Europe, and especially in Germany and Austria first. And then I want to talk about euthanasia, which was a euphemism. It was actually outright murder without having the actual principles of euthanasia, at least based on the traditional Greek definition or any definition we use nowadays as a mercy killing. It was not a mercy killing. I'll talk about brain research on these patients, which people may or may not realize, and that's kind of the crux of the matter here, because the brain research became a motivation for killing. And then I want to talk about what resistance was possible, which neuroscientists were uniquely poised to do, because it was those patients that were the targets of Nazi racial hygiene programs. And then I want to talk a little bit about the post-war period and whether we learned lessons and what are some ongoing questions. So at Nuremberg, there was a series of trials. The first was the war crimes trial, but the second, and there were some other trials of other various professions. The medical trial, also known as the USA versus Karl Brandt et al., was late in 1946 and 1947, and about 23 doctors and administrators were tried, including Karl Brandt himself, Hitler's personal physician, who was one of the lead architects of the euthanasia program. None of these were neuroscientists, though, which I'll highlight, but they were charged with conspiracy to commit war crimes, such as experimentation, mass murder on POWs, civilians of other countries, as well as participating in mass murder. And crimes against humanity were the same crimes, but on German nationals. And then their membership in the SS was a third crime, obviously of much lesser significance, but still significant. And so most of these were either acquitted or received prison sentences. 7 were sentenced to death, including Karl Brandt. No neuroscientists were tried here. So what am I getting at? Where is the connection with neuroscience? Of course, you have to understand, these were only 23 doctors, but there were thousands of doctors who were involved in crimes in the Nazi era. So the prosecution at the Nuremberg trial distilled the possible trial down to these lead agents and lead architects of the murder programs, but there was much more ubiquitous, the collaboration with the regime. So what are the connections? So anyway, the neurologic and psychiatric patients were the primary targets of all racial hygiene policies under the Nazis. And that's kind of the crux of what I'm trying to get at here in terms of neuroscientists being involved. And I'll go into what are some of the diseases, what are some of the types of patients that were affected by these racial hygiene policies. These were seen as useless eaters or empty husks by eugenically-minded doctors. And the Jewish and the political enemy neuroscientists had to be removed in the first place. That's what we'll talk about as well, to create an air or an atmosphere of collaboration with the regime and its racial hygiene policies. Forced sterilization was the first concept. It was not unique to Germany, but it was actually a legal measure. It was a law passed by the Nazis. We'll talk about that. And then euthanasia was the next step when the war started. And a lot of the personnel and tactics used in the euthanasia program were actually used in the Holocaust as well. So we'll see how the secret killing of the euthanasia programs and the model for that was used in the Holocaust as well. And brain research was possible on this group of patients because these were neurologic and psychiatric patients. Just to real briefly talk about eugenics, I don't know what the background of people in the room is, but this is pseudoscience from the late 19th century. This is Francis Galton. He was a British scientist of sorts. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, actually. In 1883, he described this eugenics movement, and it was his research on the superior genetic composition and higher social status, and that if bred with talented, that you would get positive, so to speak, or a superior offspring. And it was an applied science combining genetics and social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and the main tenet, and this is something that the Nazis used time and time out, was this idea of positive eugenics and negative eugenics, and that was infiltrating all the policies in the next several decades, especially in Germany. So positive eugenics was promoting positive elements of a society or a genetic pool, so to speak, or stock, and negative eugenics was eliminating unwanted characteristics from the gene pool. A neurologist in the United States was one of the prime supporters here of eugenics, William Lennox, who described the Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. It was ironic, actually, because his own daughter had epilepsy, and epilepsy was a target of some of the racial hygiene programs. He described Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is, I think, somewhat familiar to most of us, but especially to neurologists like myself. And he co-invented EEG machines and established EEG in epilepsy at Boston Children's Hospital. He actually talked about in this article, which I believe he presented to the Harvard Society, I think in 1938, about should they live, this idea of congenital idiots and monsters and what to do with them. That certainly killing them and eliminating them would offer no more difficulties in their selection for lifelong incarceration. There was this theory among eugenicists that criminals and prostitutes and other unwanted elements of society were all linked together with an inferior genetic stock. And he also stated that, from a racist standpoint, that the idea of limiting races through international as well as international limitation would help us solve a lot of our problems, especially in Germany, that might have solved their Jewish problems in this way. He said that we exclude aliens from our shores. He's talking about the 1924 Immigration Act, which is actually based on eugenics as well, the idea that people from southern and eastern Europe were of an inferior genetic stock. But he was talking about the international as well, that the entrance by birth is free and unlimited, even though we're restricting the infusion of aliens from other shores. So Foster Kennedy was another neurologist who espoused eugenics. He was Irish, but he was based here in New York at Bellevue Hospital and also at Cornell Medical School, and described Foster Kennedy syndrome, which I think a lot of us are familiar with, from frontal tumors that cause papilledema and optic atrophy. President of the American Neurological Association, a big neurologist at the time. And he talked about what to do with the hopelessly unfit. He said that nature's mistake is something that we must hustle out of sight, which never should have been seen at all, and they should be relieved of the burden of living. He saw this as a merciful act, and he said to have them continue living is sheer sentimentality and actually cruel, and that we should most kindly kill them, just like we would kill a stricken horse. And so this is the United States or American neurologists talking about the eugenics properties, but things were not isolated here to the U.S. That's the problem, and the Nazis actually stole a lot from the U.S. actually. So in terms of the sterilization here in the United States, which was a negative eugenic measure, going back even to the turn of the century, several states, even up to 29 states, I believe, had sterilization laws, and some of them were not repealed until actually the early 70s. Indiana passed the first sterilization law in 1907, and California, probably the most active sterilizing state, was the third one in 1909. And this was even upheld as a precedent at the Supreme Court level by the Buck versus Bell case, and about a girl committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, and that was a precedent for other states as well. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that it's better for all the world if we, instead of waiting to execute these degenerate offspring for crime, the idea that these are going to become criminals, these inferior stock, or let them starve because of their imbecility. Society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind, and 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And so that was a legal precedent. Many other states passed sterilization laws after that. It was never overturned, actually, Buck versus Bell, that's where actually Virginia didn't repeal the sterilization law until the early 70s. Some states recently have started offering reparations to victims of sterilization, which I think is something that needs to continue even more, because there were a lot of states that committed sterilization against their citizens compulsorily, but never offered reparations. And I think it's nowadays seen as quite unethical what was done. So anyway, so this is eugenic policy here in the United States. It was never a federal law, first of all, so it was only in certain states, and My own state of Illinois was not a state that offered sterilization. New York was not either, but a lot of states were. So anyway, the Nazis adopted a lot of this eugenics from the United States, and it was medicalized. Even the Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess said that National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. And here's a cartoon of Hitler as the doctor of the German people. He's exercising a scalpel on the German population, the German genetic pool, to try and purify it, so to speak. And racial hygiene had been described in Germany even in the late 19th century, and was further embellished and espoused throughout the next several decades. And like I said, Hitler had medicalized this racism and adopted it from elsewhere. He even wrote in Mein Kampf, his diary, that there is one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of immigration are noticeable. Of course, it's not Germany, but it's the United States. So there was a lot of adoption of eugenic policies from here as well. So racial hygiene was implemented in several ways. After the power seizure and the Enabling Act, which is what made Nazi Germany a totalitarian state, there was propaganda, there was what's called Gleichschaltung, which I'll talk about. There were legal actions, and then there were illegal actions, patient murder. This is just an example of some propaganda. This is an example. This is from an SS magazine in 1939, showing selection or positive eugenics on the left here. It all comes full circle from eugenics even from the late 19th century in Nazi Germany, and then counter selection. This is showing mentally handicapped persons, deformed individuals who are institutionalized presumably and a burden to society. And then this was an attempt on the Nazi regime, Joseph Goebbels and other Nazi higher-ups to convince the population, scientists, even lay public, that eugenics and racial hygiene was necessary to save costs and to purify the race itself. This cartoon says that a genetically ill individual costs 50,000 Reichsmarks by the age of 60. It's showing the burden being on the German soul. This is an ape-like individual, obviously. There were actually cartoons even in German children's textbooks in school, showing the math and then what cost savings could be achieved through eliminating the mentally handicapped. So I want to talk about Gleichschaltung. This is loosely translated, I guess, it's coordination or unification. And the idea was that all specialties, the entire German medical profession had to be centralized. It had to be brought under the aegis of National Socialist ideology. And this is what occurred shortly after, within months actually, of Nazi rule. The Nazi Doctors Association became the central agency that controlled almost all aspects of medical education, everything. It's the structure of German healthcare, the insurance panels, medical press, medical publishing, education, all the medical schools, all centralized under the Physicians League, the Nazi Physicians League. And that was how they controlled all the ideology of what happened in all the medical clinics throughout the country. And that's the only way that you can enforce a totalitarian regime, is if you have complete and total control over everything that happens throughout the profession. So I want to talk about which doctors joined the Nazis as well. More doctors joined the Nazis earlier in greater numbers than other professional groups. Upwards of almost half of all German doctors actually were members of the Nazi Party by the end of the war. A lot of them were in the SA, which was the stormtroopers, the atrocities on Kristallnacht, and earlier in the Nazi regime as well. And it's compared to 11% of all college teachers. So a lot of doctors were thoroughly indoctrinated by Nazi ideology and were enmeshed in the regime. Not all of them were necessarily fanatics, but a lot of them were enmeshed in this ideology. And a lot of them, and 7% were in the SS, which is kind of what I referred to before as a criminal organization, is determined later at Nuremberg. But these were the secret guards, the Hitler's personal bodyguards initially, but there were different sections of the SS. They became the guards at concentration camps, at all prisons. Heinrich Himmler was the head of this, who was the mastermind behind a lot of the concentration camps and mass murder of the Jews and other ethnic minorities. So more doctors were in Nazi groups than other professions, and also the same thing with the Nazi Physicians League. So what were some of the laws against some of the doctors that allowed this Gleichschaltung. First of all, there was the removal of all doctors from professional civil service, and this means all doctors in academics or in the government, essentially, 1933 April. And then there was this caused about over 40% of doctors from the University of Berlin to be forbidden from teaching and to be essentially eliminated and replaced by Aryan colleagues. And in Vienna, same thing in 1938. And neurology and psychiatry were some of the hardest hit specialties. And they were also not reimbursed by public insurance organizations, so they had to look for other sources of income. And by 1935, even there were some doctors who were able to get away with the initial dismissals because they were war veterans or they had fathers who were in the war. Those were all dismissed by 1935 as well under the Nuremberg laws. So this allowed the restructuring and unification of the whole German medical profession. So I wanted to talk about some particular directors of some German clinics who were Jews who were dismissed and replaced by essentially mediocre neurologists or psychiatrists in some situations, but who were Nazi members and who were able to get the positions from an opportunistic standpoint. One was Kurt Goldstein, who was a very well-known neurologist, but was actually marginalized to some extent after he was forced to immigrate, and wrote a great book called The Organism, kind of linking a lot of areas of neurology and psychiatry together. But anyway, it was dismissed almost a couple of years after he was the director of the large neurological clinic in Berlin-Moabit. It was one of the few independent neurological clinics in Germany, replaced by Arno Kipp, who was essentially a nobody in German medicine. This is one of his nurses, one of Goldstein's nurses, talking about how terrible it was when the SA came to pick him up and rounded up essentially all the Jewish doctors in the hospital. This was not atypical. This happened in a lot of different places, but especially Berlin-Moabit, because it was a hotbed of not only Jewish doctors, but a lot of socialist doctors were at that hospital in Berlin. But anyway, Goldstein was talking about giving his patients over to his senior doctor, his Oberarzt, and the SA told him, everyone's replaceable, even you, and that was it. And so they rounded up all the doctors and put them into empty trucks, and then took them off to Gestapo headquarters, where many of them were tortured. Some of them were released with a short period of time. Goldstein, fortunately, had some allies and was able to be released pretty shortly afterwards. But immigrated to the United States and was in Boston, and then was here in Columbia, actually in New York. Other in Hamburg, Hermann Yousefi was a neuropathologist, took over Alphonse Jacob's lab, who had described Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and was replaced, was dismissed. He immigrated to Chicago, writing a separate paper about that. Hans Jakob, a young Aryan, a Nazi member, replaced him, and we'll talk about him a little later too. Friedrich Heinrich Lewy, or actually Levy is the proper way to pronounce it, who described the Lewy bodies initially in the early 1900s, and then which is now used as primary pathology in Lewy body dementia, was replaced. He had actually just a year before that taken charge of the only independent neurological hospital in Berlin. Was replaced by another nobody, Paul Vogel, who was a Nazi Party member. Hans Berger, the inventor of the EEG, a little bit controversial in this case, but I chose him just for illustration. Berger described the initial EEG in the 1920s, and then was a supporter of the Nazi sterilization, but then was replaced. He was more of a moderate in terms of overall policy. He was replaced by Bertold Kuhn, a Nazi fanatic, and you can see here wearing his Nazi Party pin, who was one of the architects of the euthanasia program. And this is in Jena, Germany. Oscar Vogt, the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Brain Research, and here's seen here with his wife Cecile, was replaced by Hugo Spatz, and we'll talk about them as well. Hugo Spatz and Julius Hallervorden, who were lead brain researchers on the euthanasia program. But Spatz was indoctrinated fully by the Nazi regime, and talked about the research of all his helpers coming together for a common cause, and we know to whom we're indebted, and we should seek Heil to our Führer. This is one of his acceptance speech in April 1937. And Max Bielschowski, another Jew who described the Bielschowski-Silverstein for looking at neurons, was replaced and dismissed, and eventually died in exile about 7 years later, and was replaced by Julius Hallervorden at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And Joseph Gerstmann in Austria was replaced by another nobody, Alfred Edmund Auersberg, also wearing his Nazi Party pin. Gerstmann described Gerstmann syndrome, as well as co-describer of Gerstmann-Strauss-Schenker disease, and was the head of one of the clinics in Vienna, and a professor at the University of Vienna, was dismissed, and had a very, very difficult time reestablishing himself in the United States. He had an appointment here in New York, Columbia, but really didn't publish that much after he immigrated. Really kind of sad story. He was kind of cut off mid-career in 1938 with the Anschluss. But anyway, with the replacement of all these, you had the infiltration of National Socialist ideology into all these neurology clinics, and that allowed further policies to take place. Otto Marburg, same thing. He described Marburg variant of MS, and was replaced as head of the Vienna Neurological Institute by Oscar Gagel, essentially another nobody, but who was a Nazi party member. And the list goes on and on. I mean, I could go on for a whole talk just about the replacement of Jewish neurologists by non-Jewish neurologists. So the first racial hygiene policy was the sterilization law. In July 1933, sterilization was illegal in Nazi Germany before that. So the Nazis completely turned everything before that on its head. And by this law, an individual could be sterilized forcibly after a genetic health court decided that they suffered from any of these diseases, which were mainly neurologic diseases. Feeble-mindedness, which is essentially mental retardation, or mildly low IQ, schizophrenia, hereditary epilepsy, bipolar Huntington's disease, major brain malformations. All of these were neurologic disorders. Even other things like senile dementia, things that were clearly not even genetic disorders, got lumped into this, and these people were sterilized. And most of these cases were not overturned by even the higher genetic appeals court, which existed as well. So doctors had to report these cases by law, but as we'll see, if we have time later to talk about resistance, there's ways that they can find ways around that in terms of misdiagnosing some of these as non-qualifying disorders. They could be fined for not doing it. I don't know the statistics on how many doctors are actually fined. That's something I actually like to do research into, but I think it's actually probably really low. Pediatricians, psychiatrists, and neurologists were most involved in reporting these cases. So they saved a lot of money, or they were supposed to save a lot of money, although it didn't end up being a cost-saving effort, which is where euthanasia came into play. It's supposed to be 350 million to a billion Reichsmark annually to be saved by eliminating these diseases eventually from the gene pool. And even famous German neurologists at the time, such as Karl Bonhoeffer, who described Bonhoeffer's reaction, were involved in creating a nice text in 1934, a year after the law came out, saying the psychiatric test for the execution of the disease, or of the law for prevention of disease offspring, and the technique of sterilization. This was a pretty well-known publication a year after the sterilization law came out. And brain research had become very much in vogue at the time, and this idea of organic causes of psychiatric disease that could potentially even be eliminated, especially if there were hereditary sources, became a very in vogue thing in the early 1930s. And this is Bonhoeffer talking to some other neurologists here in his clinic at the University of Berlin. Bonhoeffer was the head of the University of Berlin Neurology Clinic, one of the biggest clinics in the Third Reich. So, as you can see, the neurologic causes were the main causes of the, and schizophrenia as well, so it's obviously psychiatric, but you have to understand neurology and psychiatry were very much linked in the early 20th century, and they didn't become separated until after the war when better therapeutics came out, and it just became more feasible for there to be a separate, viable specialty of neurology for people to practice without seeing the neurotics, so to speak, or the conversion disorder patients. But anyway, congenital feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, hereditary epilepsy were the main causes of sterilization. Obviously, Huntington's is another famous neurologic disease, but not as common. So it was rampant. It was not benign. Like I said, only 3% were reversed. Those resisting it were actually sometimes sent to concentration camps. It required a lot of efforts, a lot of by not only doctors but medical supply companies such as Schering, who actually profited making sterilization equipment at the time. So a lot of them were done as tubal ligations or vasectomies, but some of them were even done with X-ray castration. So this was not a benign procedure. About 400,000 people were sterilized, mainly in the 1930s. It stopped as the war went on, and obviously when the euthanasia program came out, which was much more cost efficient, I think, for the Nazis. The other thing to keep in mind is that about 2,000 people died from these sterilization procedures, so it's certainly not a benign thing to take lightly. A lot of people argue, and I actually cut some flack at the neurology meeting a few years ago when I was talking about Hans Berger, who's involved in forced sterilization, that there's such a ubiquitous thing throughout the world, and why should we single out Germany? But it was a lot more vehement in Nazi Germany. I think in 6 decades in the United States, about 60,000 were sterilized in 29 states, whereas in Nazi Germany, just in 10 years, about 400,000 were sterilized. So they were quite active and vehement in this. And like I said, the mortality rate was 2,000 dead. So And this was certainly not ubiquitous in the United States either. Even in 1935, the American Neurological Association commissioned a report about sterilization and how effective it would be, and they determined that it certainly wouldn't be. This is just a slide from the article showing that of institutionalized patients at Rentham State School in Massachusetts, that most of the parents were actually normal or unknown, and only a small percentage were feeble-minded or having mental retardation or epileptics. So Leo Alexander, one of the authors of this, wrote that they found from the study that only 3% of the insane of the next generation could be eliminated by sterilizing the insane of this generation. And so what's the point of this? It's just an unnecessary procedure. It's potentially causing risk to your patients, right? So this was not something that was widespread as people might think. So euthanasia is the next thing I want to talk about, and this was 1920. Hoke and Binding developed this theory in a book, The Release of Life, Release and Destruction of Life's Not Worth Living. And they based a lot of the principles on the fact that almost half of German institutionalized patients died in the First World War just because of starvation and malnutrition, and there was a blockade of German ports, and so a lot of the institutions didn't get enough food. But so I guess the idea was, oh well, these patients would die anyway, and what's the point about keeping them alive in these institutions? And they're just a burden to society. And on top of that, it's actually kind and to put them out of their misery, so to speak, as if you put down an animal that's suffering. And they were not seen as human beings. They were seen as only as ballast lives or empty husks without a soul. They had no sense of the value of life to Hoke and Binding. Hoke was actually a neurologist, I should mention, who was the head of the Freiburg University Neurology Clinic, and Binding was a lawyer. And so they thought the right to life must be earned and justified, not just assumed. So this was this theory infused a lot of racial hygiene policies in Germany, and it wasn't until the Nazis that it could be undertaken. So there was propaganda at the time for euthanasia as well. This is from a film called Ich Klagan, which is I Accuse. It's 1941. It was a film about an MS patient, ironically, talking about MS being a terminal disease, which I think most of us know is not, especially for neurologists. There's severe variants of multiple sclerosis, but most of the time it's a disabling disease, but it's not a life-threatening disease. But in this case, it was used as euthanasia propaganda. And this film showed a young MS patient who wanted her doctors to kill her, and her husband is the one who had to give her a lethal overdose, and he was charged with murder, and then he declared the judges cruel, and the arguments were put forth, and eventually he was acquitted. And so this was seen as like a subtle euthanasia film. A lot of the German population probably saw it for what it was worth as a propaganda film, but I think it was used as a tool to try and convince the population that euthanasia was okay.
It's a very carefully structured movie in which there's a love triangle built in where the doctor was in love with the patient, but she marries the other guy, and she has trouble playing in the violin trio, and that's the sign her MS is getting worse. And it's quite skillfully done to make the point to suck the audience into this.
Yeah, it's somewhat of a subtle message. It's actually on YouTube if anybody wants to see it. It's available. Although the Allies actually banned it after the war for all intents and purposes.
I went to an interesting talk a few weeks ago at a conference on medicine after the Holocaust, where the speaker talked about how did they teach Nazi medical students during Nazi Germany medical ethics. And he methodically went through the textbooks. They all had extensive, the requirements for learning medical ethics jumped during the Nazi era. The number of required hours went up enormously, and they had their own textbooks written for this purpose, in which this was part of medical ethics, which you're hearing about this afternoon. And there were required courses and exams to learn that this was the right thing to do. They viewed themselves as highly progressive, saving society money, and another example of normalizing evil.
Yeah, it was the humane thing to do, to put them on, and also it was a cost-saving issue. So
here in the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, they all thought that this sterilization was progressive. Why should we be paying for people to be institutionalized? We'll save society money, and we'll save these people pain.
Yeah, I mean, this policy was not enacted though in euthanasia on the population until after the war started. There was an adult program and a children's program, and certainly there was this economy that would be saved from eliminating these patients, and more cost-saving measures came about to eliminate them with ease, as opposed to some of the earlier techniques, and certainly more economical than sterilization, with all the hours and all the equipment involved. And it would free up these hospital beds for soldiers, and it would bring about savings of doctors would be available for other purposes, and nursing personnel as well. And the one interesting fact is that Hitler actually rejected an offer to take over the cost from these Catholic bishops, and that suggests a little bit against the economic explanation, and more just in terms of pure racial hygiene and eliminating these unwanted eaters from the population. So they talk about the economic argument and maybe as a way to sell it to the population, but I think Hitler's probably main driving was the racial hygiene. And so this was all accomplished not through a legal action, but through a backdated letter, essentially, to Karl Brandt, his personal doctor, and as well as Reichsleiter Buhler. And it allowed them to enact a mercy death to patients judged critically ill by a critical medical examination. And this was not a law. This was just a backdated letter. So a lot of doctors actually thought that it was a law, but it actually wasn't. Some people thought that it couldn't pass as a law because the Allies could use that as propaganda against Germany. But it's probably not the case from what I've read. At least Hitler probably didn't believe that the German people would accept a law to kill their relatives, to kill their loved ones. And he also didn't want to be limited in terms of his killing options. Because if you have a law, then you have to kill who the law specifies as opposed to being able to indiscriminately kill. And a lot of patients were killed in the lives of asylums who were not actually even part of the reporting procedures, who were just bedwetters, or who were unruly patients who the nurses didn't like. So I think this idea, and Himmler actually talked about this in terms of defining a Jew in the East as well. That to define a Jew from a legal standpoint would limit their options in terms of who they could kill, and that was not what they wanted. So the general populace seemed to really care, and I don't know if this was accomplished through surveys, or not, but they were talking about only their elderly, feeble-minded relatives. They just didn't want to be included in the law, and especially when they started seeing the buses that were transporting patients to killing centers and the smoke rising from the crematoria at some of these psychiatric facilities that were used as killing centers. All they cared about was just that their elderly, feeble-minded relatives wouldn't be included. They didn't care overall, probably, about the patients who were being killed themselves. So, and so there was the children's euthanasia as well as the adult euthanasia program. Probably about 70,000 were killed by gassing, usually carbon monoxide, or sometimes in special trucks that were designed where the gas was turned around and the exhaust of the patients would be dead by the time the truck reached its destination, or they were killed in actual physical gas chambers. And probably 5,000 children were killed through separate methods, using lethal injection, sometimes even through air encephalography or starvation. And after this program officially ended in 1941, there was protests from the churches, family members. Probably up to 275,000 were killed. So not anywhere near the numbers of the Holocaust, with the 6 million or 11 million, depending on how you look at it. But this was a large number of patients, and they were largely patients with neurologic and psychiatric disorders. And this even continued after the war. In July 1945, some Allied soldiers had to put a stop to this at gunpoint, and so this was a fanatic movement in a lot of the neurology and psychiatric clinics. So, and this was an uncovered document from one of the killing centers showing not only the numbers killed, 72,000, but 8 million, almost 9 million Reichsmarks were saved through this. And this was talking about the numbers of disinfected. That was the euphemistic language that was used. That these patients were disinfected, or that they're removed from the gene pool, so to speak. So this is just one of the transport vans. A lot of younger, more obedient doctors were in charge of these killing centers, and they were led to a shower room where the gas was piped in, and they were also, after being cremated, the gold was collected from their teeth. So you can start to see a lot of the parallels between the euthanasia program and the later Holocaust. This is 1940, 1941, whereas the final solution didn't come out until after 1942 with the concentration camps and where the Jews were imprisoned, and other ethnic minorities like Gypsies as well. So when there was a mass deception too, the relatives got form letters essentially saying that their relative had to be transferred, and that they had to be they had arrived, and that there were visiting hours. It was kind of a mass deception, and that usually that they died from a false cause, like pneumonia, heart failure, appendicitis, even status epilepticus for some of the patients who were epileptics. The appendicitis thing is kind of funny that some of the relatives caught on, that the relative had already had their appendix removed. And so, of course, why are they being told that the relative now died of appendicitis? So, and sometimes there would be multiple letters sent to the same household for siblings. Multiple siblings were killed on the same day. We all suffered from the same. So the population began to catch on. That's why the official euthanasia program ended in 1941 with the mass gassings, and it became a decentralized operation at many different individual clinics up until the end of the war. So, and the patients reported were all neurologic and psychiatric patients, criminally insane as well. Patients without German citizenship, other ethnic minorities, including Jews, were included, and especially if they weren't able to do routine labor, they were included. But all the neurologic diseases that were included in sterilization law also applied to euthanasia. In the children's euthanasia program, similar story. Patients with deformities, microcephaly, mental retardation, Mongolism, hydrocephalus, spina bifida, cerebral palsy, all reported for killing. And a lot of the professor doctors of neurology throughout Germany were actually some of these T4 experts who were reviewing these questionnaires that were sent from various clinics that described what the patients had and whether they could do work or not, whether they had any Jewish ancestry, and those were used as criteria to determine whether they should be put to death. These doctors never saw the patients themselves. It was all reviewed at T4 headquarters in Berlin, essentially. And you can see a lot of these professor doctors of neurology and psychiatry, like Heidi, Keen, Maus, Pansy, Polish, Karl Schneider, Karl Zucker, Konrad Zucker, I'm sorry. So a lot of these were all professor doctors of neurology and psychiatry. So these were high-ranking people. These were not obscure, fringe, fanatic Nazis, basically.
The categories in the previous slide in the lower left, which you listed as these terms, Negro or Negro hybrid, these particularly infuriated the Nazis. At the end of World War I, French African colonial troops were part of the Army of Occupation near Alsace-Lorraine. And so by the 1930s, there were 12 and 15-year-olds from sexual liaisons between these French African colonial troops and German women. And they particularly wanted to sterilize or kill such children.
They called them the Rhineland bastards. Yeah, they weren't officially qualified under the sterilization law. They didn't meet the stipulations of the law, but they were sterilized nonetheless. They were teenagers who were of they were essentially mixed African German ancestry. So anyway, this was interesting. I mean, these doctors saw it as an opportunity. They set all their ethics aside. They thought their side would win and that they wouldn't face any consequences. And that's why a lot of these, I think, professor doctors even were part of this program, which is completely illegal. And even if it was indirect, they lent a scientific legitimacy to the program because of their ranking. One of the directors of one of the asylums said that it reassured me to learn what eminent scientists took part in the action. Schneider, Heidi, Nietzsche, and Brandt, Hitler's doctor who was accused at Nuremberg, said, we're not the regular professor of the universities with the program. Who could they write better, who's better qualified than they? So this was not a light issue, the fact that there were so many high-ranking academic professors involved in the program. So I don't know how much I want to talk about Operation 14, F-13. This was a kind of a phylogenetic turning point where mentally ill in concentration camps were actually sent to be killed at some of the euthanasia centers. I'm going to actually skip through a lot of this. And it's just, I want to talk about these phylogenetic links where I think some of these have become apparent to everyone already, but the fact that the euthanasia program and these racial hygiene policies were secret, that there were the SS involved, that there was no law, that there was deception of families and patients, that there were even separate pavilions for killing in some of the child killing programs. They're almost like concentration camps at some of these psychiatric hospitals to segregate some of the patients to be killed. That they used terms like disinfection, and then some of the medical terminology also used in the selection ramps at the concentration camps as well. And then they talk about 14F13, which is kind of a hybrid program. The fact that poison gas was used to kill them, and this is interesting too, that Imfried Erbel and Everell and Franz Stengel, who were involved at some of the euthanasia facilities, actually became commandants at Treblinka concentration camp too. So they lent their expertise from the euthanasia centers to be used at the concentration camps where Jews and other ethnic minorities were killed. So a lot of links here between killing of neurologic and psychiatric patients and killing of ethnic minorities. And there were experiments done in both places, and everything was utilized, which I'll talk about in terms of especially the brains and spinal cords, but gold teeth was taken. So there's a lot of links between euthanasia and the Holocaust. There's a really good book by Henry Friedlander called The Origins of Nazi Genocide, which covers this in great detail as well. But I want to talk about a few specific examples. I'll try not to go on too long, but maybe we can skip over some stuff. But this is a nice illustration of euthanasia, racial hygiene, and then brain research. This was at the Wiesengrund facility in Berlin, where Ernst Hefter, a T4 expert and Nazi doctor, as well as his assistant Gerhard Kujat, were some of the head and the assistant doctor, and Bertold Ostertag was the neuropathologist involved. And this is a nice illustration of how things worked under the racial hygiene policies of the Nazis to lead to essentially a publication in a neurology textbook of a patient's brain. And so the nurses were incentivized as well by bonuses. This is the head nurse, Erna Kaminsky, preparing maybe a lethal injection of one of the patients. This is one of Bertold Ostertag's helpers preparing the child for autopsy. And this is an interesting issue here too, where Kujat, is shown here in the picture, Hefter's assistant, was this is terminology anymore, but this is a patient with microcephaly. Her name was Valentina Zacchini. I don't think there's privacy issues, to be honest, with talking about Holocaust victims. And these are all publicized in Berlin at the Federal Archive, actually, these names. Anyway, so this patient was killed as a scientific curiosity, so to speak. She was murdered in June 1941 after the euthanasia started. Even though there had already been publications about her before then, now they could actually perform a neuropathologic exam. And so it all came full circles. They were able to talk about her physiology and the pathogenesis of her disease, and now they're able to prove it by showing her brain. And so she was the first Kiwi, Kinder Wiesengrund, the children of Wiesengrund were killed. There were 105 that were on record in Bertold Ostertag's files. This is showing him later in the 1960s at the University of Tübingen, where he was the chair of neuropathology. This was Valentina's brain. It was published in 1956 in a pretty well-known special pathology textbook, the neuropathology section. And this has actually been cited 33 times, if you believe what Google Scholar says. Obviously, that's been double-checked. But this is a vicious circle, and it continues to be citations of this unethical research to the modern day. So I want to move also to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Brain Research. It's a nice, very modern facility. It was very well funded. This is during the Nazi era, actually. You can see that it very well stands out from the background. Very nice for Allied bombers, actually, to destroy, too, during the war. This is where Hugo Spatz and Julius Hallervorden did a lot of brain research that was unethical. These two, Hallervorden and Spatz, had described the disease named after them in the early 1920s. But it was this transition from Hugo Spatz taking over at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute from Oscar Vogt basically led to a transition to talk about pathological diseases as opposed to physiologic diseases. And the idea was, especially in the Nazi era, we can conduct familial brain research, and we can collect a large collection of brains over time, and researchers serve the future of the nation. So this was Spatz in 1937, also during his introduction speech. So you can see the prelude to collection of brains from the euthanasia program, even well before the euthanasia program started. And Hallervorden, this is from an interview after the war, told the euthanasia organizers, I heard they were going to do that, so I went up to them and said, look here now, boys, if you're going to take the brains, or you're going to kill them, at least take the brains out so the material can be utilized. So this is kind of a utilitarian concept. Although the problem is that he didn't realize that he was lending a lot of legitimacy to the killing by offering the fact that a high-ranking professor was willing to do brain research on these killed patients. He said, how many can you bring? An unlimited number, the more the better. And he accepted these, of course, and where they came from and how they came to me, he said, it was really none of my business. Is that how all of us would react nowadays, is the question, right? So I think that's an ethical thing to think about. He gave them the fixatives, and they came bringing the brains in batches of 150 to 250 at a time. And he said he became slightly nauseated at one point and actually refused some of the brains. He didn't feel there was anything of significance, but he certainly saw no ethical problems with this whatsoever. It was all part of his indoctrination and this utilitarian concept without any concern for medical ethics at all. He thought that the cause of psychiatry was injured and the psychiatrists had lost the respect of the German people. That was his only concern, really. And he said that they were killed in such large numbers that they couldn't do autopsy of the bodies also to see if there were general effects from the pathologic exam that could be used to describe the disease more. And so he thought that reduced the scientific potential. So Spatz, as the boss, certainly denied that any member of his institute knew about this, and he thought it was a secret SS operation, and that he thought that the invaluable material was lost to remain unutilized. So there's no way he could have been unaware of brains arriving in large batches, and the fact that Halliburton eventually collected about 700 brains, and this is the largest collection in Germany. And 105 brains actually were shown to come from Spatz's own department. So some people say, oh, we should name it Spatz disease instead of Halliburton-Spatz disease, but it really shouldn't be renamed totally. And we'll talk about that in a second if there's time. But both of them got a lot of research funding, and that was one of the motivations. And it was a treasure trove of material. And they both were attending a meeting in the early 1940 where the euthanasia program was planned. And so they both were complicit from the very beginning. And Spatz even said that he approved, I've seen documents more recently, that he approved of the euthanasia examination of the brains from the euthanasia victims and shares responsibility. And he said that was the only opportunity for control. This was his justification. That this control was that they could tell if the disease was actually genetic, or if it was a genuine epilepsy, or if it was caused by an actual structural cause, like a brain tumor. And so the family wouldn't be ostracized under the umbrella of having a genetic disease in the family. And that was his justification, that it wasn't an unethical issue because they were helping the family by collaborating with the murderers. Seems very circular logic to me, but anyway, that was what Hugo Spatz said, one of the most well-respected German neurologists at the time. So there were other examples. I don't know if we have time to go through these. Ran through these in Poland, or not modern-day Poland. Hans Scherer collected about 300 brains. Wilhelm Schultz in Munich also had a brain collection of 194 brains from at least 4 children's facilities, and published 11 papers on this. And Schultz was the head of the Max Planck Institute in Munich after the war as well. So this is not an isolated issue. Hans Jakob, I just published this paper, published on at least 1 brain from a euthanasia victim in 1956 also. Actually 2 brains, I'm sorry. There's, both these children were killed. This is showing the difference between a megalencephaly in a normal person and megalencephaly in a diseased person. And this was a victim of the euthanasia program in Lüneburg, which is one of the special child killing facilities. And I can send anyone a copy of the paper if they are interested. In Vienna, a large collection was amassed, and this collection actually existed up until the last decade. This is the whole shelf of over 1,000 brains initially, which got weaned down to about 400 brains. But Heinrich Gross was a neurologist during the war who talked about, he was at the Children's Mental Hospital in Vienna, the Spiegelrund, and children described his coming on the ward like as if a cold wind was coming in, or as if the grip was hurt, and he selected patients to die, to not die, based on whether he liked them or not. It was a large brain collection. And later on, throughout the next several decades, Gross published up to 34 papers on a lot of the brains that were collected. And some of these papers continue to be cited, so this is not a process that was limited to that time period. This is just a summary of the different areas and different centers in Germany that had a collaborating neuropathology institute, the directors, and how many publications came out of those institutes. This is one of the textbooks that will be in my upcoming book, actually. So I'm happy to share this more with people later about this. Not just brain collection, but also experimentation was possible on some of these patients. George Schaltenbrand was a very well-known German neurologist and had international connections at the time. This is showing him in his SA uniform in the war. And actually had Rockefeller funding as well. And became the chair at Würzburg and published a paper describing about 47 patients from the nearby mental asylum in 1940 who were inoculated with monkey CSF, spinal fluid that had been induced to have an experimental allergic encephalitis from MS patients in the first place. It's a very complicated procedure, but he was basically trying to prove a viral cause of multiple sclerosis. The results were completely inconclusive, and he said that he could bear responsibility on these individuals because, and you shouldn't do these on a normal person or even a sick normal person, but on patients who suffered from an incurable mental illness or demented humans, this was an acceptable risk, that he was injecting them with this monkey spinal fluid without their consent. There were 2 patients who died. One of them was from massive brain tumor, but at least the other one is not clear, and very inconclusive results. This was published in 1943, and it's been cited about 74 times actually since then. So, what should we do with this? And some of these citations are actually recently, from 2013, 2014. I verified those from Google Scholar and PubMed actually. So these are still being cited, a lot of these unethical studies. And Nachtsheim was the head of the, actually geneticist in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and I don't know if I want to go into this too much, but it's a very circular logic where he put 6 children from the Brandenburg facility in a vacuum chamber to try and prove whether they would have seizures or not. And it had already been shown that patients don't respond to low oxygen by having a seizure, epileptics, and Nachtsheim actually wanted to prove his rabbit experiments by putting children, as if the children were of lesser value to humanity than the rabbits. So anyway, I think maybe we're up in terms of time, but so these are a lot of the motivations: grant funding, publications, career opportunities, advice about genetic diseases, complete abandonment of medical ethics. So anyway, I think I'll have to end. I'm sorry. I was going to talk about resistance as well, but maybe for another talk. Anybody have any questions?
We'll put a bookmark in it for returning.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll jump forward real quick to my take-home points. I'm sorry if I can do that. Hold my mind. I've got a lot of slides. I'm sorry. I have so much. I have 15 weeks of seminar, basically, material that I tried to distill into. Actually, this is interesting. One of the resistors in Norway was just named Righteous Among the Nations. We talked about that earlier. I was glad to be at that ceremony in Oslo 2 years ago. Håkon Satra, who was a Norwegian neurologist who described Satra-Hodgson syndrome. It's a genetic syndrome, acrocephalosindactyly. But anyway, he hid 12 Jews in his hospital and had a food storage warehouse for the Norwegian resistance. And finally, he was named Righteous Among the Nations. So I was really happy to be able to speak at that a few years ago. And Yad Vashem was very gracious about that. And there's someone else we're trying to get named as well, who's a neurologist in Holland who resisted the Nazis and saved about 300 half Jews actually from being deported to the east. So anyway, I'm sorry. I have to. If anybody wants to leave, I would understand. I was going to talk about unethical research after the war as well, because it certainly didn't end at Nuremberg. Unethical abuses continue in the modern day, and I guess this is an interesting thing to consider too in terms of America versus Nazi Germany. And this is something we have to take home. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it can't survive their being repeated. This is from Robert Jackson, the Chief Justice, the military tribunal, but I think it applies to all of this unethical abuse among scientists. So, I hope everybody understood that the connection between neurology and the Holocaust and medical ethics, and I welcome any questions.
I would propose that we have time now for Rabbi Krupka to speak, and that we'll do the questions afterwards. Thank you. I promised that we would have new speakers. We're going to conclude the presentations with remarks by Rabbi Moshe Krupka, Senior Vice President of the Tyrrell College System. Rabbi Krupka received his ordination from the Rabbi Yitzhak Elchanan Theological Seminary, has a master's degree in secondary education from Yeshiva University, and received his undergraduate degree from Yeshiva College. Rabbi Krupka will be our third speaker, and then after that, we'll do some Q&A. Rabbi?
I would much rather Q&A. So Dr. Zeidman, I was fascinated by your presentation, and I concur with your opening statement. I think that that this campus and this school should be quite proud that on this day it's sponsoring a program when most institutions of higher learning are not. And if you can look at some of the current events and to hear and to see some of the speakers that are appearing on various campuses in these coming days and weeks, I think that New York Medical College, our chancellor, should be quite proud that we are gathered here this evening. We just concluded the holiday of Passover, and I was lucky enough to have a 93-year-old Holocaust survivor at our holiday table. And quite innocently, with all the ruckus that was going around in our home, our children were home, our granddaughter, our first granddaughter, like, hey, well, he turned to me, very lovely man, and he said, how does it feel to take on the responsibility? And I said, excuse me. Said, well, I'm 94 years old. He divulged that he had a very serious illness. And he said, I can tell you every step that I took in Auschwitz. I can tell you what it felt like to be rounded up as a young man, thrown into the back of a truck, never to see my parents again. I saw it. I can tell you what it was like to look at an army uniform and cringe, because that could have been the last sight that I would see. I can tell you what it felt like to be dehumanized and to begin to believe that I had no worth as a human being and be subject to all of these horrific experiments that we've heard about tonight. But I'm not going to be here much longer. And more importantly, people of my generation are not going to be here much longer. So he knew my parents. I'm a first generation survivor. In fact, last year's Hashoah commemoration, I got up and said, I'm a first generation survivor. And he said, Moshe, responsibility is yours now. Are you up to the challenge? And so, here we are, we're sitting. And as the rabbinic personality in the crowd, so what words of wisdom can you offer that will somehow take all this incredible research that's so incredibly important for humanity, for education, for scholarship, and to the Jewish people, as a testimony to what was done to us and to others in the name of a master race. So what words of wisdom can you offer that will inspire, possibly offer some modicum of motivation for the future? And it's very presumptuous, because really no one can speak. No one can speak for the victims. Forever, their voices have been stolen, never to be replaced. And no one can speak for God. No one could presume to understand what the calculus was that allowed for this to happen. So I want to share with you something that I heard from about victims of the Holocaust and was told through the prism of their children, other first generation survivors. And it's an incredible story, and I'll wax a bit rabbinic if you don't mind. Remind me next year, I'll share with you the significance, if you'll invite me, the significance of such a gathering on an academic institution. But that's not for now.
We'll see how the story goes, and then we'll take an academic vote.
and he's my friend. We're all familiar in the book of Ezekiel. There is the prophecy or the vision of the valley of dry bones. This is in the shadow of the destruction of the temple, the diaspora of the Jewish people. They're being thrown out of the land of Israel. God speaks to his prophet Yechezkel, that's Ezekiel in Hebrew, and he transports him to this valley that's filled and littered with all of these dry bones. And God says, prophet, prophesies over these dry bones. And like a good prophet, the Navi Yechezkel, Ezekiel, begins to speak to the bones, and as the verses in Ezekiel tell us, great sound of rattling occurs. Bones start snapping into place, joints start to fasten, muscles and tendons start to envelop those bones, flesh appears, and all of these dry bones become human beings resurrected. So, our Talmud asks a question. This is from the Talmud Sanhedrin that deals with matters of judicial nature. And they ask a very simple question. What happened to all of these resurrected human beings in the valley of the dry bones? What happened to them? So there are two opinions. I'm getting a Jewish argument, can't have an agreement. There's always one opinion, then another opinion. So the first opinion offered by Rabbi Eliezer is that these individuals were resurrected. They sang praise to the Almighty, and they died. Rabbi Elazar ben Yossi, who hailed from the Galilee, offered a different opinion. In his academy, what he said was, these individuals that were resurrected went back to the land of Israel. They married, and they had sons, and they had daughters, and they built the land, and they lived and thrived. In the academy of Rabbi Elazar ben Yossi, another rabbinic figure stands up, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, Rabbi Yehuda the son of Beseira, and he said, I want to testify that I am a descendant of those individuals that were resurrected. These are the tefillin, the phylacteries. Tefillin are items that are worn during Jewish prayer on weekdays. They contain certain verses, certain excerpts from the written law, from the Torah. And these are the tefillin that were passed on to me as an heirloom from my ancestors that were given life by the Navi Yechezkel. Fast forward 2,000 years. I verified the story yesterday. 1945, April. Either April 11th or April 12th. There seems to be a discrepancy. The Nazi concentration camp of Buchenwald is liberated by the U.S. Armed Forces. A young 20-something rabbi by the name of Herschel Schachter is with the advancing Allied troops. He walks through the gates, Arbeit macht frei, and he sees a valley of dry bones. He sees emaciated men, women, children. Chief Rabbi Lau was 7.5, 8 years old, one of the youngest children of Buchenwald, liberated by chaplain, Rabbi Herschel Schachter. He starts going up to the victims, the inmates. First of all, they run away from him because looking at an army uniform when you were a concentration camp inmate meant death, possible death. And all of a sudden he realized. So he started screaming and speaking to them in Yiddish, in their mother tongue. And they said, "You're Jewish?" And they looked on his lapel. And on one side was the insignia of the Ten Commandments, and on the other side was a Star of David. And they couldn't believe a rabbi in uniform that had come to liberate them. And he started gathering all of these inmates around him. In fact, if you go on to YouTube, led by Rabbi Schachter in Buchenwald, Armed Forces Radio. Incredible moment. Incredible moment. So he gathers all the inmates around him. He says, "Was kann ich tun für dir? What can I do for you?" So there was one 17-year-old who walks up to Rabbi Schachter. He says, "Rabbi, I want to tell you something." He said, "I've been in Buchenwald for months. I was able to smuggle my tefillin that were given to me at my bar mitzvah into this camp. And every morning, before we were sent out on forced labor, I put on tefillin and people in my barracks were able to offer just a few words in prayer. A month ago, the capo in our barracks found the tefillin. He beat me mercilessly. He showed me the scars on his hands and on his back. Rabbi, I haven't put on tefillin in a month. Maybe you have a pair of tefillin." Rabbi Schachter pulls out his knapsack, takes out his tefillin, hands them to Hershkowitz. And tears in his eyes, he says, "Here you are, my brother." This story was unknown to the Schachter family until a number of years later at the Jewish Center in Manhattan. The rabbi of the synagogue, his name is Rabbi J.J. Schachter. He now is the senior scholar at Yeshiva University. He was the rabbi of one of the premier Orthodox congregations in Manhattan. That day, that Shabbat morning, giving the sermon, was a visiting dignitary from Israel, a member of Knesset. And as he rose to give the sermon that morning, he said, "I want to tell you what inspired me to go into communal service." This individual was an academic, a scholar, an ordained rabbi. He led a congregation in Haifa. And he told this story of Hershkowitz and Rabbi Schachter. And he said, "I want to tell you what inspired me to give back to society. When my father told me that Rabbi Schachter Sr. gave his personal tefillin away so my father could put on tefillin, that empathy that love of humanity, that embrace, inspired me to become Rabbi, Dr., Professor Daniel Hershkowitz, mathematician extraordinaire, the former Minister of Science and Technology for the State of Israel, the rabbi of a congregation in Haifa, Tel Aviv, and now the president of Bar Ilan University. He said we should all be inspired by this act of nobility of someone reaching out to a victim and giving them some comfort in their time of need. Rabbi J.J. Schachter, who I spoke to yesterday, rose and he said to Rabbi Dr. Daniel Hershkowitz, member of Knesset at the time, he said, I must disagree with you, sir. My father is no hero. Your father is the hero. Your father could have asked for anything. He could have asked for an extra ration of bread, new clothing, a pair of shoes. And yet he had the vision, the nobility, the courage to embrace life and all of its ideals, and to be able to go on with his life, like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi said of those dried bones, to be able to go to the state of Israel, to have a family, to have children, sons and daughters, and have them believe in the importance and significance of tefillin, for God Almighty, for a purpose in life. And I would humbly suggest that they're both right, because here were two incredible heroes, one who gave and one who had courage to persevere. So ladies and gentlemen, I invite you in this responsibility that was given to me by my Passover guest, the responsibility to perpetuate memory, to have empathy, to be able to reach out to those in need, all of those in need. You know, the Holocaust is certainly a Jewish event, but it's not exclusively Jewish. Injustice, cruelty, persecution can't be tolerated anywhere. Anywhere. The Washington Post reported on April 6th, I have a copy of it here, Chief Rabbi Israel Me'olam got up in Israel and basically screamed and demanded that the Knesset in Israel come back from vacation. They were in pre-Passover vacation to discuss what he called the Holocaust in Syria that was going on. Join me. Join me in remembering. Join me in reaching out to helping others, all people that are in need. And join me, like Mr. Hershkowitz Sr., in imparting on our students, on people who we come in contact with, a mission, a vision, a love of life, to live it to its fullest, to realize the great potential that each and every one of us has as a community and as individuals. With your permission, I'd like to offer just a memorial prayer for those who perished in the Holocaust, all those who perished in the Holocaust. And then I think I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Halpin, for Q&A. If you don't mind standing, please. What I will do is I will read it in the Hebrew and then follow it in English. And I want to thank you again all for participating in what I think is a very significant event for this campus and for our university system. El Moli Rachamim Shachein Bam Ramim Hamseim Nuchon Nuchono Al Kanfei Hashchina B'malos Kedoshim V'Tahorim Kizor Arkiam Azhirim Es Nishmos HaKedoshim V'Tahorim Shahumsu V'Shenehergu V'Shenishchatu V'Shenisrafu V'Shenitba'u V'Shenechnatu Al Kiddush Hashem Al Yidei Hanatzim Yimach Shemam V'Zichram Babur Shekulanu Mispalim Ba'avuram L'chein Ba'harapim Yaskirim V'Seisa K'nafav V'Yolamim Yitzrar B'Tzar HaChaim Es Nishmosehem Adonai Hu Nachalosam V'Yanuchu V'Shalom Mishka V'Sehem V'Nomar Amen. O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence in the lofty levels of the holy and the pure ones. To the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled through the hands of the Nazis and their accessories. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore may the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shelter of his wings for eternity. May he bind their souls in the bond of life. The Almighty is their heritage, and may their repose be in peace on their resting places. And let us respond. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi. So I'll be seated. I would propose that one of the benefits of Alumni House is it's homey, so that rather than do everyone stand up and ask questions, you can stay with us. You don't have to rush off to the airport yet, do you?
No, got a few minutes.
All right. If Dr. Zeidman is sitting there and Ann is there and Rabbi Krupka is to my right, we can gather around whoever you wish to ask a question or comment with, and we can chat rather than have to do formal Q&A. Since two of you brought it up, I would like to say finally, before we go to group discussion, when I went to this meeting about teaching medical ethics after the Holocaust in Houston a couple of weeks ago, they showed a survey by the Association of American Medical Colleges, which observed that out of the roughly 141 medical schools in the United States, about allegedly 16% claim that they have Holocaust education as part of the curriculum. Most of them say, well, we have one lecture, or we mention it in one lecture. What we learned as we went around in discussion in that meeting in Houston is there's really one school in the United States that has it deeply embedded into the curriculum as part of the coursework, and we're sitting at it. And I think we should all be really proud of that. And whether we gather here as a group of 100 or a group of 15 or 20, we'll keep doing it because that's our particular mission at this college. Thanks to all our speakers, and thanks for joining us. And folks, in addition to asking questions and having discussion, let's eat, please, because it's not going home with me. Thank you, everyone.